I first saw Kena Bridge of Spirits during the PS5 reveal livestream back in June of 2020. It immediately stood out for me from the rest of the pantheon of AAA titles that also got shown off for the first time. The trailer was absolutely stunning with bright, vibrant colours, a great 3D animation art style, and some incredibly cute characters. I would later realise that the developers are a first-time studio who were previously known for creating visual effects for commercials and TV shows, as well as creating this Majora's Mask short film. So this is a post-production studio that went from creating offline material that is passively consumed to a 15-person game developer. A strange turn for sure, since those two creative mediums are quite different, since making something look good is very different to making something feel good to play. But as fate would have it, Kena Bridge of Spirits is everything I wanted it to be, and more. Kena harkens back to the PS2 era of games, taking clear inspiration from titles like Zelda, Jak and Daxter, and God of War. The structure follows very closely to something you would see in the earlier Zelda games, with the world being broken up into sections that have their own unique style and gameplay elements. Entering each area for the first time will give hints to the player about what they can expect to unlock shortly, which in turn will allow you to continue further through the area and access previously blocked paths, be that in the current biome or back in the hub area in the centre of the forest. In each of the three main biomes, you'll come across both puzzles that need to be solved and optional puzzles that lead to a few different rewards. Enemies will populate corrupted zones, causing the surrounding vegetation to be withered and rotten, and there are plenty of hidden collectibles dispersed around the environment. Capping off each area is a small dungeon that incorporates every mechanic unique to that biome, before finally entering a boss's lair. If this all sounds rather simple and straightforward, well that's because it is. Kena, much like the games that inspired it, was simple and knew where to invest your time and energy. Countless little mechanics that you will never use, or endless square mileage to explore, are not something you'll find in Kena, and I loved that. I think there are 4 reasons someone would want to check out Kena. The first being the gorgeous art style, or the surprisingly mature and touching story, or the exploration and puzzles, or the combat. Admittedly, none of these mechanics are mind-blowing, or even that great, but they all hit a level of quality and charm that makes Kena a game you do not want to miss. After finishing the campaign, what I was most surprised by was how competent Kena's story is. While the art style sells a children's game full of a lot of fluff and simple ideas, the story is far from that. Kena is known as a spirit guide, someone who seeks out corrupted or suffering spirits who are trapped in the living realm unable to journey into the next life. Wooden masks are carved for the dead. This is done as a sign of honour, but it is also a way to identify struggling spirits since they take these masks with them. In the opening moments, you'll run into these 2 little boys who offer to help Kena reach the mountain shrine, but first they ask you to help find their brother Taro in the nearby forest. This begins the main quest, which lasts around 6 to 10 hours depending on how much time you spend sifting through the environment for collectibles and secrets. The first destination on your journey is the village in the centre of the forest. It acts as your hub that you will come and go from many times, with a few new areas opening up each time you return with a new piece of equipment. When you first arrive, the town is poisoned with enemies around every corner and no inhabitants living in the many houses. Clearing the village of enemies will reduce the poisonous areas and bring a small slice of life back into the environment. As you move through the village, you might notice that there are blocked paths with mailboxes in front of them. This denotes that there is a spirit mail hidden in the environment somewhere. Once you find it and bring it back to the mailbox, you'll be able to open up the gate, allowing you to pass through and solve a puzzle and kill enemies to clear the area of corruption. This mechanic is one of my favourite little details in the entire game. I love base building in games, and while this isn't exactly that, it is very similar. Instead of progression being tied to clearing a marker off a map, it's instead tied to restoring your hub area. Something that you visit constantly and get to see all the progress you're making to help bring it back to its former glory. This is such a small addition to the game, but I just loved it so much. Another thing I loved was that buried in this game is a 45-minute short film that is handled with so much grace and care. Every character in this story is so believable and so well realised, be that Kena herself with her raw desire to do good and help others in need, or the villain who is brilliantly humanised by the end. Additionally, there's a 6-minute cutscene towards the middle of the game that is just one of the best moments I've experienced in a game all year. It's just utterly fantastic. After exploring the village and talking to a couple side characters, you'll enter the first main biome, which tasks you with clearing the corruption in 3 different areas, all of which have their own puzzles and mini bosses to solve and defeat. I suppose this is the best time to talk about the puzzle design. Whenever you're not in combat or exploring the world, you'll probably be figuring out a puzzle. These come in many different flavors, such as controlling the rot to destroy barriers blocking your path or cleansing shrines. These are pretty straightforward and never offer much challenge, which is completely fine, but I feel like the movement speed of the rot could have been increased slightly. This criticism extends to any time you need your little rot buddies to do something for you. Their movement speed is way too slow for it to be enjoyable. I think what makes a good puzzle is being able to solve it as quick as you can figure it out. I don't want to feel handicapped because of something like movement speed. When I've figured out what needs to be done, but I'm watching the rot go at a snail's pace, it can get pretty old. Later in the game, however, you'll get a bomb that allows certain objects to float temporarily, merging exploration and puzzles into one. Throwing a bomb at glowing blue rubble will allow you to run across it. This further progresses to the rubble having an area you can hit with your bow, making the floating path change direction. Overall, if you liked the puzzles in something like God of War 2018 or Concrete Genie, I think you'll enjoy what's on offer here. I certainly had a good time with them, and there's a few surprises in the final act that I'm not going to mention. Something that I enjoyed way more than I thought I would was the combat. Combat is probably the thing that I think will be most overlooked in Kena due to its simplicity, but I feel like this is an incredibly well developed combat system that with a few tweaks and additions could be amazing. Combat starts out very slow. I mean, like, it can take a few good hours for it to click and feel like there's depth. Kena herself is capable of a light and heavy attack, a shield that repels damage and acts as a parry if timed correctly with an enemy's attack. The first weapon you unlock is the bow that transforms from your staff. This acts exactly how a bow works in something like Horizon Zero Dawn, even down to slow motion being an unlockable ability. These unlockables are where Kena's combat system gets interesting, with things like a charged heavy attack, sprint attacks, and increased bomb potency becoming available. But the real show stealer comes from the rot. See, these guys aren't just for cute cutscenes or charm. They're your special abilities letting you stun enemies for a short time. With an upgrade to your bow, any arrow shot at a stunned enemy will ricochet to nearby enemies. There's also a charged heavy attack that is rot infused, creating a hammer that can strike from a distance. While combat ends really strong, it starts out a bit too slow. A few of the abilities you unlock should have been in your kit from the very beginning. I do wonder if this had anything to do with how difficult combat can be due to enemies' beefy damage output, where a few lousy hits from even a standard mob can kill you, and on top of that, most battle arenas will only have a maximum of 2 healing plants, and many times won't actually have any, causing you to have to play carefully and take on each opponent with precision and patience. To account for this, Kena uses a lot of subtle techniques and combat design decisions to assist the player that probably won't even be noticed by the average person. On the low end, you have the weak spots that a lot of enemies have scattered around their character models. These areas can be shot with your bow for a massive hit to your enemy's health. Later on in the game, you'll come up against opponents that force you to use this mechanic in order to defeat them. Even one of the pinnacle boss fights is built around this weak spot mechanic. More noticeably, however, is the constant stun locking your hits apply. In other games, this is known as poise, where a few hits in a row could throw your enemy off balance, opening them up to even more hits. Where this becomes balanced and something you need to be aware of is when a combat system is trying to be challenging. It's not like that in Kena. Every enemy besides a few of the brutes have no poise at all, allowing you to hit them just once and keep them stun locked and unable to fight back. And it doesn't even need to be a heavy attack, even though that does end up being your go-to towards the end game. But I think the developers knew players would take advantage of this, even if it was only subconsciously, since all those brutes I mentioned a moment ago have counter attacks to being stun locked. So what happened to me quite often was I would get in this routine of just spam attacking everything I came across, but then I wouldn't be patient when versing a tougher enemy and just get hit for a massive chunk of health. This is what I mean by Kena being difficult from time to time. It's much less about the enemy complexity or the amount of enemies you'll be versing at a time, or even the amount of health you need to fight through. It's more geared towards your understanding of how to take out each target, and I just think that's fantastic combat design. Last on the list of subtle advantages is the attack range of your staff. This thing will carry you far further than you would expect, especially when charging up a heavy attack. If you've ever played Sekiro or Monster Hunter World, you might have noticed how your positioning against an enemy is extremely important if you want to hit them, since your character model doesn't move when attacking, leading to a far more challenging experience. But that's not how it is in Kena. This is much more of a third-person hack and slash than it is a strategic combat game. I feel like I analysed Kena's combat system way more than the average person would, or would ever think to, but I don't know, this just clicked with me, and when a game has this much charm and a good combat system, I really want to give it the time it deserves. Before we wrap this review up, I want to quickly mention just how good looking this game is. I mentioned in my Rift Apart review that was the best looking game of all time, and while Kena isn't as visually impressive as Rift Apart, it is a close second. The actual fidelity of the textures isn't the best you've ever seen, and neither is the crispness of the resolution, at least on PS5. What brings this world to life is the lighting on display here, the world's architecture, and the composition of how certain scenes are framed. Kena employs many different lighting techniques, least of all being the god rays that lift up all the forest locations. As you run through each of these areas, much of the ground will be cloaked in shadow with little sections of light blotted around the place. Where this brings out the beauty in the thriving areas, it also contrasts beautifully when you're in one of the corrupted zones and the colour is stripped back almost entirely, save for some rich shades of red. Another visual element I loved was the composition that Kena is able to pull off thanks to its vertical exploration. Instead of the world being flat and you moving from one end to the other, the world is actually quite small with you exploring vertically and around mountaintops, leading to a lot of vantage points throughout your journey where you can gaze off into the distance and see how far you've come. I cannot express how satisfying it is to look over the world below and pick out the landmarks you've discovered, or to see the village in the center slowly transform from a corrupted region to a thriving sanctuary. Man, I feel like I could just keep going on forever about Kena, and I didn't even mention the beautiful score that elevates every moment and helps bring this world to life, or the lovingly handcrafted animations and interactions with the rod, or the way effects and enemy trails are exaggerated, making different animations and the style as a whole so succinct. If this looks interesting to you, please pick it up. It's a discounted title selling for $40 on PS4, PS5, and PC. Ember Labs have created one incredibly special game, and it being their first attempt is all the more impressive. I hope we see a sequel to this one day, because Kena has the opportunity to be a franchise worthy of sitting alongside the greats.
The path of a spirit guide is a lonely one.